We're here at entry 23, the very end of April, Thursday, April 30th, 1964. This is another long one. This is 3 pages. It involves some anticipation of the FBI appearing before the commission. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yes, there were three agents from the FBI who were going to testify before the commission a day or two later. In advance of that testimony, Sam Stern and I and Mr. Rankin met with Assistant Director Belmont and Inspector Malley from the Bureau to explore what limitations might be observed by the Commission in order to protect the secret techniques and sources that might be reflected on these documents or addressed by the agents. So there was general readiness on the part of the Commission to accept the Bureau's restrictions on the kind of documentation that would be made part of the Commission's records and therefore published. At the same time, we wanted to have access to the complete set of records in the possession of the FBI to see that they had produced everything that we had asked for with respect to previous, not just previous interviews of Oswald, but other information with respect to Oswald, so that we could make a judgment about whether the FBI had an obligation to identify Oswald in advance of the motorcade. So these were important strategic issues for the FBI, which was under direction from the director to cooperate fully with us, and Mr. Belmont and Inspector Malley repeatedly emphasized that they wanted to cooperate in all regards. So we discussed what kind of restrictions could be observed, and we seemed to reach agreement with the FBI on that. And Belmont agreed that at some subsequent time, Sam Stern could personally explore all the records in the Bureau's possession that related to Oswald, and that was the subject of further discussions a few days later.
You mentioned in your book that you were particularly interested in Agent Hosty because of his connection to Oswald prior to the assassination. Hosty becomes a very significant figure because of various things that happened, some of which you were aware of and some of which you weren't until years later, over a decade later, in fact. But I want to bring up something in particular because we're here at this entry from April 30th, and as you write in your book, I'm on page 147 in your book, you mention that there was a story that broke in the Dallas Morning News this last week of April. So when this entry was written, it says that an FBI agent told Lieutenant Jack Revel of the Dallas Police Department, quote, only moments after Oswald was brought to the department on November 22nd, that, quote, we knew he was capable of assassinating the president, but we didn't believe he would do it. That's a very significant statement. Now, to be clear, Hosty and Revel, both of them, they don't deny the fact that they had that they had a conversation the afternoon of the assassination. It's the contents of that conversation that have become so controversial, because Hosty claims and testified to the effect that he never said those words to Revel, but Revel sticks by it, and it's included in a report that he wrote Chief Curry that afternoon. So where do you fall on that disagreement between Revel and Hosty about this very significant sentence?
I think as the information became available during our investigation and a decade later, I have increased confidence that the policeman Revel was the more accurate in recalling this conversation. That comes in part from the fact that Hosty was significant, as you suggest, because he had gone to interview Oswald, and he wanted to interview Oswald, but did not know where in fact Oswald lived. He had discovered that Oswald was employed at the depository, but he knew that Oswald was not living with his wife and daughters at Ruth Payne's house. So on November 1st, well, just 3 weeks before the assassination, he went to interview Ruth Payne to find out, more specifically, where exactly Oswald was living in Dallas. The file with respect to Oswald has been sent from New Orleans to to Dallas about a month or so earlier, when people learned that Oswald, in fact, had moved along with his family from New Orleans to Dallas. In the first interview on November 1, Ruth Paine said she did not know where he lived, but she might make an effort to find out. And Hosty also had the occasion to see Marina Oswald, who had recently given birth to the second daughter. And she was, of course, quite terrified with meeting a policeman, thinking that the policeman would be like the KGB agents in dealing with her. But Hosty was very, very gentle in telling her who he was and what his interest was, and simply wanted to talk to her husband. And he left without the information that he wanted, but Marina Oswald made a note that, in fact, he had shown up, and informed her husband accordingly when she next saw him. Hosty returned a few days later, November 5, to see if there was any additional information, and there was not. And it was subsequent to these visits that Oswald responded by writing a note, which he delivered personally to the FBI office in Dallas on or about a week or so later. In other words, about 10 days or so before the assassination, he delivered a note to the FBI that was the contents of which was not disclosed until 10 years later in 1975, when an informant advised that there was a note of this kind, and there was a congressional hearing at which both Hosty and the receptionist in the Bureau office testified as to its content. According to the receptionist, the note was in an unsealed envelope, which was delivered to her, and by someone she did not know. And she opened the envelope and saw it was addressed to Hosty, and her recollection was that it was quite a threatening note. In her recollection, as she said, it was something to the effect of, "If you don't stop bothering my wife, I'm going to burn down the police department or the FBI office," signed Lee Harvey Oswald. According to Hosty, it was not a threatening note. It was a simple statement of this kind: "I would appreciate your not interviewing my wife any further. If you do so, I'll have to seek a remedy from appropriate authorities," and unsigned. So of the two, it seems to me the receptionist interpretation is by far the more credible, because what we know about with Oswald is that he was never reluctant to sign his name to anything, and he did, in fact, express anger on more than one occasion with respect to the agency's treatment of his wife. So my view in retrospect is that Hosty's awareness of this note sort of is and concealing it is very troublesome. Hosty says that he did not really read the note until Oswald was in fact arrested, and that would have been just before he went to the department and encountered Revel. So if he read the note before he went to the police department and entered the interrogation room, where Oswald responded very antagonistically with Hosty once he learned who Hosty was. So I think that the implications of this never were available for the commission to consider, but years later I think one could fairly say that Hosty failed in a very serious way by not proceeding to explore this note and to consider it a matter that deserved an immediate effort to interview Oswald. Two conclusions that have come to mind and been talked about among members of the staff and others interested in this issue. And one is that a note of this kind written by Oswald is strong evidence that as of 10 days before the assassination, Oswald personally had no intention of killing the president and was not part of a conspiracy with that goal in mind. No one with a conspiratory thought of assassinating the president would write such a threatening note to law enforcement authorities so in 10 days or so before the motorcade. it certainly would have precipitated action by the law enforcement authorities. And of course that supports a second conclusion, that if in fact Hosty had gone to interview Oswald and located where he lived, it is almost certainly the case that the name would have been given to the Secret Service and protective measures would have been taken so that Oswald was not in the depository when the motorcade went past the building. So it's a very serious claim, I know, to place this burden on Hosty, but I think it's a fair in terms of the circumstances and his inability to respond promptly to this note, it seems to me, was not fully explained by him except to suggest the burden of other matters and so forth and so on. So Hosty, over the years, has turned into be much more important than we understood at the time that he appeared before the commission back in 1964. And of course, he never disclosed to the commission during his testimony that he had any such reaction from Oswald to his 2 visits with Ruth Paine.
And it's worth noting the note doesn't exist. Hosty, according to Hosty, at the behest of his boss, Gordon Shanklin, tore the note up and flushed it down the toilet, which is a terrible thing to do. I mean, that's a significant piece of evidence, and it's led to all sorts of conspiracy theories, because when you have a note from Oswald, you can have it say anything you like to fit whatever particular theory you're pushing. I think Oliver Stone presents it as Oswald giving the FBI a note warning them of the assassination plot to kill President Kennedy, which you can make all sorts of illogical leaps from that. Why would, if you had explosive information about a plot to kill the president, why would you put it in a note and just leave it at the office? But regardless, it's become an issue that, as you say, paints Hosty in a very negative light. And coupled with, if we believe Revel, that Hosty said, we knew this man was capable of killing the president, I mean, this makes Hosty almost complicit in the assassination. Yeah,
yes, it does. And of course, he defiantly and understandably resisted that interpretation in subsequent publications and appearances in the decades following the assassination. And as you have pointed out, his boss Shanklin directed the destruction of the note. And many years later, after this became public, the Department of Justice, through its Criminal Division, recommended that he investigated the matter and recommended he be prosecuted for perjury. But the officials in the Justice Department at that time, in around 1988 or whenever it was, declined to do so.
And as you point out in your book, there's a building here in Dallas named after Gordon Shanklin today.
Correct. Right.
One more thing about Hosty, since we're talking about him already. Oswald had Hosty's telephone number and I believe his license plate number in his notebook, and that became an issue because the FBI left that out of one of the early reports. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, and I think that was in the Hosty's book because it may have been information given to him, or he found out from the wife. I'm not sure about that. I think the wife made a note that
Bugliosi says that she went around the side of the house and wrote down Hosty's license plate number and gave it to Oswald.
Yeah, and it was inaccurate in 1 digit or something to that effect. But you're right. When early in the investigation, the FBI supplied the commission with a copy of Oswald's quote historic diary unquote, and the FBI deleted from its copy of the diary the page with the information about Hosty. And when this was noted by Norman Redlick, I think principally, and then shared by among other members of the staff, when we asked about this, they responded that they had deliberately done that because including Hosty's information in Oswald's diary didn't produce any investigative lead that would be of interest to the commission. Mm-hmm. And the FBI said that was their purpose in providing the copy of the historic diary, but the omission of that information seemed to the staff members to be somewhat protective of the agency and was another step early on in the investigation that caused the staff to be alert to the Bureau's own vested interest in this investigation.
on the second page of this entry, there's a short paragraph I want to read. The meeting was a very successful one in my view and reinforced the impression Mr. Rankin and I have had since the beginning, to the effect that the director of the FBI has taken action to see that this commission's investigation is to be aided in every possible way. Is that written with a little tongue-in-cheek, or were you being serious?
Well, I think I'm being serious, although there were already so many lapses that it's a little, this is another case where I was being too young and optimistic, perhaps, about relationships. And in any event, it surely was not a fair description of what was going on, and we can elaborate upon this later on.
Yeah, we have a couple of entries later is when Mr. Stern goes and looks at the FBI files, so we'll talk about that then. Before we wrap up this entry, the bottom of the second page and onto the third page, a little mini crisis. Suddenly, there's budgetary constraints, and the volumes might not be published at the same time as the report.
Yes. At the conclusion of a commission meeting, Rankin reported to me that the three members present, who were the non-congressional members, so that McCloy and Dulles and the Chief Justice, had decided that the expenses involved in publishing all the records of the Commission's work would be a burden on the federal Treasury, and they did not think that the publication could be justified. And Rankin, of course, felt strongly the other way, as did I. And the Chief Justice had said, well, if the members of the committee from the Congress agree that there'll be funding available, then of course the three non-congressional members would go along with that. So I immediately tried to schedule a telephone call, if not a meeting, with the Deputy Attorney General on the subject, because I knew publication was enormously important, and found that the deputy was out of town. But Rankin was able to solve this problem the next morning by calling Senator Russell, who agreed readily that the funds would be available, and so the mini crisis was resolved. It was one of those events that was not unusual, in that there was a surprising development that we had to deal with, and more often than not, we were able to solve the problem and go forward with our work.
There are lots of little fires that pop up that are solved by the next entry, which is good to know. At the very end, you went to dinner with Mr. Bell and Mr. Slauson, Mr. Liebler and his wife, and you didn't talk about work, which is good. So it's nice to point out occasionally that you were able to do some fun stuff. At one point, you go to a ball game and things like that. So.
That's right. I don't want to overemphasize the amount of work that I did. I worked very hard, of course, but you had to have some break. Every so often, and those of us who had families had obligations there that were important to observe, notwithstanding the demands of the Commission.